the way I start to think about it is you think about something like TikTok or Twitter as like a virus. It's a powerful virus. It comes along in any situation where it came along, it would have had an effect on our attention. But it arrived at a moment when it's almost like our collective immune system for attention was already down.
Now, Johann Hari is a writer who's had a second chance. His career seemed in ruins after a plagiarism scandal as a journalist, but he picked himself up and has now become a best-selling author. He's also given some TED Talks as well on the issues of addiction and depression that have garnered millions of hits. He now has a new book called Stolen Focus, and it's about attention span and seemingly our lack of it. Good afternoon to you, Johann. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, hi, Kate. It's lovely to be with you.
So you spent 3 years researching the book, and probably had to put a lot of focus behind it yourself. What what drew you to the topic? Why was this such a bugbear for you?
Well, I noticed that for a long time, for about 10 years, it felt like my own ability to focus and pay attention was getting worse. And I could see a lot of people around me who seemed to be in the same state. And when started looking at some of the kind of early evidence, I was quite struck by some of the figures. The average office worker now focuses on any one task for only 3 minutes. But I kind of thought, well, doesn't every generation think this, right? You get older, your brain deteriorates, you mistake your own deterioration for the deterioration of the world. But really, it was looking at the young people in my life who I really love, who often seem to be kind of whirring at the speed of Snapchat, that made me think, is there something outside the norm happening? So I ended up for the book going on a really big journey all over the world, from Miami to Moscow to Melbourne. I interviewed over 200 of the leading experts on focus and attention. And I learned from them that there's scientific evidence for 12 factors that can make your attention worse or can make it better. And loads of the factors that can make your attention worse have been really supercharged in recent years. So it really helped me to understand this, because it's not that our attention collapsed. Our attention's been stolen from us by these big forces. And if we want to get our attention back, which I think we urgently need to do, we're going to have to take on these forces, both in our personal lives and collectively.
Which are the most urgent forces to take on?
It's interesting because actually, obviously, when I talk about this, initially, most people think about tech. And absolutely, there are aspects of the technology we use that are designed to hack and invade our attention. But I was surprised at I'm sure we're going to come to that. But I was surprised that of the 12 factors I learned about, I don't think actually that the components in tech are the biggest. What's happened is that tech has interacted with a lot of the other forces. So the way I start to think about it is you think about something like TikTok or Twitter as like a virus. It's a powerful virus. It comes along in any situation where it came along, it would have had an effect on our attention. But it arrived at a moment when it's almost like our collective immune system for attention was already down. Lots of things were already happening that would make our attention worse. So I'll give you a couple of really obvious examples. There's really strong scientific evidence that to pay attention fully, you need to sleep. You need to get proper sleep. You need 8 hours sleep a night. But we sleep on average an hour less than people did in 1942. In fact, children sleep 85 minutes less a night than they did a century ago. And when you're sleeping, you're repairing, your brain is healing, it's cleaning itself. So that's one example. The way we eat, I can go into this more, is hugely harming our ability to pay attention. So there were all these factors that were playing out that were already harming our attention. And then this new and invasive technology comes along that ramps up the invasion of it. So in a way, when you're looking at the biggest, there are some really big ones that I'm sure we'll come to, but it's as much the interaction between these things that is so degrading us.
There must be benefits, though, to things like tech. I mean, is this not just the human race evolving? It's all very well saying, well, you know, 50 years ago we were all sleeping more and we're eating differently now. But is this not just the evolution of the human race?
Yeah, I thought a lot about this question. It's an important one. So there's obviously massive benefits from tech. I think we can all try to imagine the last 18 months, if we had not had access to technology, how much worse it would have been. And it's interesting because when I started looking into this research and interviewing all these experts, I came in exactly that question and thinking that in a way, oh, am I pro-tech or anti-tech? But what I actually learned is that's the wrong way to think about it. That's precisely how the people who are profiting from the current invasion of our attention want us to think about it. Because the truth is, if we're being anti-tech, what does that even mean? We're not going to convert and join the Amish, right? We're not going to give up our technology, nor should we. There was a thing that happened in the past that really helped me to think about this in a more nuanced way. I think we're probably about the same age, Kate. When I'm 43, and I remember, I can just remember when I was a kid, that it was quite normal. My mum used to put leaded petrol into her Mini, and it was very normal. Leaded petrol was the norm in Britain when I was a child, and just before that, I don't remember this, but in the 70s, a lot of people would paint their home with leaded paint, and it was discovered by scientists. It was known for a long time that exposure to lead really damages children's ability to pay attention and focus. So what did we do? We didn't ban petrol, we didn't ban paint, we banned the lead in the petrol, we banned the lead in the paint. So you can see I'm in a room that's been painted, right? I can see cars out the window that are going by that have petrol in them. In the same way, there are specific aspects of the way that our technology currently works that are, as the designers admit, designed to hack and invade our attention. I can explain why. And I think what we have to do is deal with those aspects, because what we want is all the good stuff of technology without
Yes.
especially attention invading elements.
We don't want to ban tech, and we want to be able to use it responsibly, but I think it is part of our lives, isn't it, whether we like it or not? And we
And it
know
should be,
through
yeah.
documentaries like Social Dilemma how tech companies have in the past and still continue to manipulate us to not necessarily make us spend money, but spend time on screens. That is of the highest value to them. Tell
Yeah,
me about.
I think you put that really well. And there was a moment that I spent a lot of time interviewing some of the people who are in the Social Dilemma before the documentary started filming, and after, and lots of other people who were involved in designing this tech world. There was a moment. There were a few moments that really fell into place for me. I went to interview in Moscow a guy called Dr. James Williams, who was a key figure at Google for many years and was horrified by what they were doing and quit. And he had a moment. He was speaking at a tech conference in San Francisco to, an audience of people who are designing the world in which we currently live, in which your kids spend so much time. And he said to this audience, if there's anybody here who wants to live in the world that we're creating, put up your hand. And nobody put up their hand. And it really helped me speaking to him and lots of other people. There's a moment with Tristan Harris, who you'll also know from that film.
Yeah, I've interviewed him.
Me,
Yeah.
oh, isn't he an
Yeah,
amazing?
he is.
I think he's a real hero, actually. I was speaking to him last night, and I think Tristan is arguably one of the most important people alive today. And Tristan said to me, if you want to understand the ways in which this technology is invading our attention specifically, because Social Dilemma was about a lot of things, but I'm talking specifically about attention. He said, ask yourself a question. If you open Facebook now, it gives you loads of options. It'll tell you who tagged you in a photo. It'll tell you whose birthday it is. It'll tell you what you said on the same day 10 years ago. There is no button on Facebook that says, which of my friends are nearby and would like to meet up? Right now, that's a very easy thing technologically to design. There is a design that will tell you, which a few people use, that will tell you who's nearby, but there's no way for them to indicate, I want to meet up. Do you want to meet up with me? Now, the minute I say that, lots of people listening will think, well, that would be a really helpful. I would like that. That would be a
I
really
don't know
nice.
whether I would, actually.
But that's
I
interesting.
think I like
Tell me
my
why.
privacy.
No, you would opt in. You'd have to opt in. It's a button where you would opt in. You
It
wouldn't
utterly
impose it.
horrifies me to think that even my friends know where I am at any given time.
Oh, I totally agree with you on that. Sorry, I don't think I explained that well. I'm talking about a button where
Yeah.
you could indicate on the night, say it's a Wednesday night, you're like, I want to go out.
Yes.
Who's around? Who
Well,
wants to
you're
meet up?
talking about basically, starting to look at how we, as a society, need people around us, and it's about meeting people and sort of joining with friends socially rather than doing it all
Yeah.
through a screen.
Exactly. And I think what's important is when Tristan said to me, so just to finish that point, because I think what you're saying is right. What Tristan said to me is if you want to understand why that button doesn't exist, it helps you to understand some of the ways in which our attention is being invaded. Because whenever you open a social media app, they start to make money in two ways. The first way is really obvious. You see advertising. We all know how that works. Second way is much more important. Everything you do on social media is scanned and sorted by that app to figure out details about you and your life, which they then sell to advertisers so the advertisers can target you. You're not the customer, you're the product. So every time you put down Facebook, Facebook loses, or any of the social media apps, they lose those two different revenue streams from you. So that's why they don't have a button that says, do you want to meet up offline? Because of course, then you'd put your phone down, your friend would put your phone down, you'd look into each other's eyes, you'd talk to each other. And for Facebook, because of the current business model, it's not inherent to the idea of social media. That is a disaster for
Yeah.
them. And this is why we have to deal with the underlying business model.
We should explain that Tristan Harris was a design ethicist at Google who basically now leads at the Centre for Humane Technology and has been one of the people kind of outing what was happening at Google and various other large tech companies back in the day. Let's loop this back to your 3-month abstaining of tech. I think that's probably the best way to put it. Now, this is a key part of the book. You decided to sort of pretty much go without all communications tech for a 3-month period. Just briefly tell us what you did and what you'd learned at the end of that.
Well, I was so worried about the young people in my life and I was disgusted at myself. I just thought, you know what? I'm just tired of being wired. I'm going to try 3 months completely without this stuff. And so I went away to a little town called Provincetown in Cape Cod. Obviously, I was very privileged to be able to do that. And I had some ups and downs and a real haze of decompression, but I was amazed by how much my focus and attention came back. I thought I just got older, my brain's deteriorated. My attention went back to what it was when I was a teenager and I could read for really long periods of time. And I remember at the end of that time in Provincetown thinking, well, this is going to be my life now. I never want to go back to that. And within a few months of being back in this environment, my attention never went back to quite as bad as it was because I integrated a lot of changes into my life that I talk about in the book, but it got quite bad. And it was a moment I understood this when I interviewed Dr. James Williams, who I mentioned before. And he said to me, well, the problem, Johann, is what you've done is it's like you've thought that the solution to air pollution is to wear a gas mask, right? Now, gas mask will give you relief from air pollution, right? If I lived in Beijing, I'd wear one. But it's not the solution. The solution in the longer term is we have to together deal with these really big factors that are invading and ruining our attention and focus. And I talk in very practical ways how to do that. I went to countries that have done that, from France to New Zealand, that have begun on that journey, that there are specific things we can do together to begin this process of restoring our attention so we can all do the things we want to do more, like unplug, sleep, and a whole range of things.
And where are you now with it, your attention span?
It's a lot better. I don't know if you can see from the angle you're at, Kate, but in the corner of the corner of my room there, I've got something called a K safe. Have you heard of these? If not, I really recommend getting one. It's a plastic safe. You take the lid off, you put your phone in, you put the lid on, you turn the dial at the top, and it will shut your phone away for anything between 5 minutes and a whole day. I have an app on my laptop, the one I'm speaking to you through, that just called Freedom, that can just cut you off from the internet for however long you tell it to, or specific websites if you have a problem with a particular website. I do that for 4 hours a day. If I didn't, I wouldn't be able to do my work as a writer. But equally, it's a good illustration because I think there's 2 levels at which we've got to tackle this. There's individual, and there's lots of other changes I made that we can talk about if you want, but there's the individual level at which we have to protect ourselves and our children. But we also, I'm conscious that a lot of people listening will hear me saying, oh, I do that for 4 hours a day. And they're going to think, I can't do that, right? And there's places that have begun the solution to that collective problem. For example, in France in 2018, they had a huge crisis of what they called le burnout, which I don't think I need to translate. And the French government set up an inquiry to figure out what was going on. They discovered that 35% of French people, workers, felt they could never unplug because their boss could message them at any time of the day or night, and they'd be in trouble if they didn't answer. So the French government, when I heard that, I remember thinking, when I was a kid, the only people who were on call were doctors, and even they weren't on call all the time. Right now, almost half the economy is on call all the time. So the French government introduced a very simple legal reform that we can all fight for here. It's called the right to disconnect. Super simple. It says 2 things. You've got a right, you have to have your work hours legally defined in your contract, and you have a right to not have to answer work calls or work emails outside work hours. And I went to Paris, obviously, before the plague to talk to people about this. Big companies get fined 70,000 euros if they try to get one of their workers to answer an email an hour after they've left. You can see how that's a reform.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You can see how that does a good job. The book's great. I've been reading it, and
Thank you.
I guess I'm blown away by the amount of scientific data in it. As you say, you spent an awful lot of miles traveling around. You've spoken to an incredible amount of people for it, and it's that hook of scientific data that I suppose comes from your journalism. But I'm also aware that in the past, having admitted to plagiarising material, changing Wikipedia entries of journalists who you didn't like, there might be a need for you to justify every bit of data in your writing, in the need for people to trust what you're writing. Is that anything that you consider when you're writing a book like this? Do you still feel that you need to ratify yourself and your sources?
I think you put that really well, Kate. So 12 years ago, I did two things that were completely wrong. I presented some quotes that had been said to other journalists and as if they had been said direct. In fact, I said they had been said directly to me, which is a form of plagiarism. And I edited some Wikipedia accounts under a false name, both of which are awful, dishonest things to do, for which I paid rightly a big price. Since then, obviously, I went away for 3 years. I didn't say anything publicly, never made any excuses for it because there are no excuses for it. And then I came back with a really well-resourced, a well-sourced book. All the audio for all the quotes from my books go online. My books are very extensively fact-checked with my publishers. And I think that's why my books have done well. They've been praised by a very broad range of people, from Hillary Clinton to Noam Chomsky to lots of leading doctors. Was nominated for an award by the British Medical Association. That's why one of them was made into an Oscar-winning film. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It means there's a high bar. It's why material in my book is very well sourced. It's why I go through a very extensive fact-checking process, and most importantly, it's why, because the thing I did wrong was
Yeah.
about the quotes. It's why I
It's
put those
also
quotes online.
why people will be pulling apart some of the data that you mentioned. There's a 65-second claim there. So basically, that our teenagers now only focus on one task for 65 seconds. And this is what's going to happen, sadly, if you admit to plagiarizing and altering things, that people are going to zero in, aren't they? Focus in on some of the facts that you give, and they're going to try and discredit them. And that's happened in this case. There's a journalist called Dr. Matthew Sweet who's found flaws in Naomi Wolf's research, which is where the 65-second claim comes from. He says it's only a study of 12 people, and it suggested that actually 65 seconds might be actually a good position to be in. It might have its advantages.
Yeah, so
How?
as you know from the book, I say that's a small study. It is indeed a small study. So the individual you mentioned just comes from a different philosophical position to me. So I interviewed all these experts, and I was persuaded by the scientists who argue that we really are in an attention crisis. Dr. Sweet, the historian you mentioned, has a very different perspective and a long-standing and legitimate perspective, where he believes there is no attention crisis. This isn't correct, and he has a kind of range of criticisms of that. So I would argue we just have to go back to the evidence. We think about, for example, just one we mentioned earlier, sleep. I interviewed the leading expert in the world on this, one of the leading experts on the world on sleep, Dr. Charles Czeisler at Harvard Medical School. And he said to me, so there's good evidence, and many other scientists have shown this as well, that we sleep less than we used to. Even if nothing else had changed, even if all that had happened is that we sleep less, that alone would be leading to a significant attention crisis. And that's not the only significant change that's happened. Dr. Sweets argues, and it's a reasonable position, as you know from the book, Kate. It's an argument I go through in detail in the book. This is a moral panic. So it's important to distinguish two kinds of responses to concerns, right? So a moral panic, a good example would be an example. In the 1950s, there was a real panic about comic books, right? There was a fear, oh, children are reading these violent comic books, it's going to make them crazy. Or think about one that we'll both remember, the panic in the 90s about rap music. There was a big concern that, oh, people listening to rap music, it's going to make them violent and aggressive and so on. And we now know, looking back, those were what's called a moral panic. So it's a change, a new thing comes along, people think it's the end of the world, it turns out to be fine. That's the lens through which Dr. Sweet, who's a historian and a good historian, sees this debate. I came to see it based on interviewing all these experts through a different lens.
Mm.
And that lens
Is
is,
it then, Johann, is it then hard for you when you're doing a bit that like this? So I just wonder, bearing in mind your history, would it not just be easier to write fiction rather than? And it feels to me at times like you have to justify yourself because of your background, because of the plagiarism. You have to justify yourself and then justify yourself again and provide evidence to the extent that you've got
no,
audio recordings. Do
no, I'm
you?
really happy. Yeah, I understand the question. It's a legitimate question, but no, I love the work I do. It reaches a really huge audience of appreciative people. So no, I embrace being held to a high standard. And just to finish that point about moral panic, 'cause I think it's really helps us to think about why this is important. So think about a subject like this, where I interviewed so many people, and I believe this subject to be so important. So sometimes we worry about things that turn out to not have been worth worrying about. But there are other times when we experience not a moral panic, but a deep form of concern. So think about the obesity crisis. I interviewed one of the leading experts on children's attention in the world, a man named Professor Joel Nigg, who said that the situation we're in now, we need to ask, the phrase he used was whether we're in an attentional pathogenic environment, one that makes it very hard for all of us to pay attention. And the analogy he drew is with the history of the obesity crisis. When in the 70s, there was very little obesity, but people warned that the trend suggested we were on course for quite high levels of obesity. And so, excuse me. And some people at the time said that was a moral panic, right? It turned out to be, in fact, we should have listened to them much sooner. We all know about the climate crisis as well. Warnings about that were dismissed as hysteria. And I think there's a real joy in doing work that you know, that investigates really important questions. Because you think about how important attention is.
Mm.
You can't pay attention. Everyone listening, if you think about anything you've ever achieved in your life, whether it's, being a good parent, setting up a business, whatever it might be, that thing you did required a lot of deep and sustained focus. And when attention and focus break down, as I believe there's evidence, good evidence is happening, we can't achieve our goals as well. We can't solve our problems as well. And that's happening at a moment when obviously collectively we have a lot of problems we need to solve.
Yeah.
But to be able to explore those questions, to meet the leading experts, to spend 3 years, as I do on each of my books, looking at the best evidence, and then for it to receive such a wide audience and such a receptive audience is a really nourishing thing for me. And I embrace the high standard of that.
Yeah. I think some people might say, is it right to assume that we can't achieve our goals as well because our attention span is different to how it was in past decades, let's say
Yeah. And
50 years ago? I mean, that is the danger with work like this. And there's some good investigation by you. You clearly very, very thoroughly researched, but you come at it from the angle that we have an issue with our attention spans. Not that it's changed, and this is why, and these are the learnings about them, but you come at it with a sort of a preloaded concern about our attention spans.
so it's a legitimate question. I came to that conclusion quite late, actually. So initially, if some of my friends have been reminding me that when they used to be worried about their attention, I would always say, every generation thinks this, it's just a bit different. I would justify, I think in the early stages of using social media, when it first came along, I would really justify my behavior going, oh, it's just a different way of attention. But actually, it was really interviewing these experts. I'll give you an example. I went to MIT to interview Professor Earl Miller. He's one of the leading neuroscientists in the world. And he said to me, look, you've got to understand one thing more than anything else. Human beings can only consciously think about one or two things at a time. That's it, right? It's just a fundamental human limitation. The human brain has not significantly changed in 40,000 years. It's not going to change on any time frame we're going to see. But what we've done is we've fallen from mass delusion. We believe we can do many things at the same time. The average teenager believes they can follow 6 or 7 forms of media at the same time. But what happens when scientists get people into labs and get them to do lots of things at the same time, or think they're doing lots of things at the same time, is they discover that actually when you do that, you're not doing lots of things at the same time, you're juggling, you're very quickly alternating between tasks. And that comes with a really big cost. It's called the switch cost effect, is the technical term for it. And it turns out when you're switching tasks very rapidly, your ability to do any of those tasks profoundly degrades. Professor Larry Rosen, for example, found that they got people, they got students to watch a lecture, and some of them received text and some of them didn't. The ones that received text did much worse, and the more text they received, the worse they did. There's a huge amount of evidence for the switch cost effect. But we're all like those students in the lecture, right? So much of the time, we're all being interrupted. Professor Michael Posner at the University of Oregon found that if you're interrupted, it takes on average 23 minutes to get back to the same level of focus that you had before. And that's really important because if you turn on your phone tonight, Kate, if you've got an iPhone, and it says you spent 3 hours on your phone, that sounds bad enough. But if those 3 hours were spread throughout the day, actually that means you lost much more than that
Much more time than
stolen
that.
focus. And that's
Yeah, I
why we have to
understand.
really get to the bottom of
Yeah.
these questions.
I do want to raise the issue of your TED talk on depression as well, and
Oh, thank you.
antidepressant use, which did cause some controversy. A lot of people applauded it, but a lot of people said that it was irresponsible of you to suggest that maybe some people who used antidepressants, not all, but some, shouldn't be using them, and that actually the cause of their depression is more environment than anything else.
Yeah, so I take the position of the World Health Organization, which is that there's three kinds of causes of depression. There's biological causes, there's psychological causes, and there's social causes, and they're all interacting. And there were people who just flat out lied about my book and said that I told people to stop taking antidepressants. Anyone who's read it knows the advice I give in the book and in my TED talk is for the people who are being helped by antidepressants, as I was for a while, that they should carry on. But we have to have a much wider debate than that. Look at the fact that, for example, under COVID, according to Sajid Javid, the health secretary, drawing on the NHS data, depression has doubled. Now, what happened in the last 18 months is not that all of our brains suddenly went haywire, right? What happened is there was a huge change in the way we live. We became much more stressed, we became much more lonely. Now, the fact that stress and loneliness caused a huge increase in depression during COVID should help us to understand some of the reasons, not all, why depression and anxiety were rising before COVID. And that's most important because it can help guide us for how we can
Yeah.
reduce depression and anxiety as we emerge from them.
After I watched the TED talk, I think that what you say is valid, but I'm also really aware, as you will be too, that your audience is vulnerable to a point that when you suffer from depression and when you have depression, and I talk about this experience with members of my close family as well. All they
Mhm.
want to hear is that there's a reason why they have depression, and that if they do something, they can have a path away from it. Anyone with depression is desperate not to have depression, and I think.
Well, that's precisely my message, Kate.
But it's
Exactly what you
difficult if
said.
you're telling
There's
people that
there
actually
is
some people shouldn't be on antidepressants, which is how people interpreted it. You do have a fragile audience sometimes, and
so I don't think it can be sensible to say that people should not put forward the position of the leading medical body in the world, the World Health Organization. But I think the way you put it is really well. Explaining to people, the way you put it is excellent. Explain to people who are depressed, there's a reason you feel this way and there's something you can do about it. It's precisely the message of my book about this, Lost Connections. And I spent a lot of time again with the leading experts on this. So, for example, here in Britain, in East London, there's a program that has done incredibly well on this. I used to live nearby, although sadly I was never referred to this program. It's run by a doctor called Sam Everington. And Sam was very uncomfortable because he had loads of patients coming to him with terrible depression and anxiety. And like me, he's in favor of chemical antidepressants for some people. He thinks they have real value. But he could see that for many of them, chemical antidepressants gave a little bit of relief but didn't solve the problem. Still valuable, still worth doing. And he could see that they were often depressed and anxious for really understandable reasons, like they were really lonely. So he pioneered a different approach, offered alongside the option of continuing chemical antidepressants. It's called social prescribing. It's
yeah,
very simple. I interviewed, so a woman, for example, a woman called Lisa Cunningham came to Sam's doctor's surgery. She had been shut away with terrible depression and anxiety for 7 years. And Sam said to her, "Don't worry, we'll carry on giving you these drugs, but we're also going to prescribe something else." He said to them, "I'd like you to come twice a week to meet with a group of other depressed and anxious people here in the doctor's offices, not to talk about how bad you feel. I mean, you can do that if you want, but the goal is to find something meaningful that you can do together." The first time the group met, Lisa literally started vomiting with anxiety. It was so overwhelming. But the group started talking. They said, "Well, what can we do?" There was an area behind the doctor's offices that was just scrubland. They decided they were going to build a garden. Now, these are inner city East London people like me that don't know anything about gardening. They started to take books out of the library. They started to get their fingers in the soil. They started to learn the rhythms of the seasons. Um, the way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. There was a small study in Norway of a similar program,
yeah.
found it was twice as effective as chemical antidepressants because it was dealing with some of the underlying reasons. Now, that's not to oppose it to chemical antidepressants.
Yeah.
There
So
needs to be a
your
big,
argument, clearing
broad
all this
menu.
up, your argument is that things like social prescribing, looking at our environment, is an important part of tackling depression,
I mean,
but
you know,
you are not against the use of antidepressants.
anyone who's read my book, Lost Connections, knows that's the case.
Okay.
I take the
All
position of the
right.
World Health Organization.
Okay. I'm going to finish this up. In the book, Stolen Focus, you talk to the reader and ask them to not blame themselves for their inability to focus, that our lack of focus isn't necessarily our fault. And you encourage people to show kindness to themselves. Have you learnt to extend that to yourself? Have you forgiven yourself? And how has that process been?
I don't, I think if you do something that harms other people, you should never talk about it in public in a kind of see it from my point of view, present a redemptive narrative. It's insulting to the people you harmed. So I don't talk about it in those terms. I did something wrong. I paid a significant price that was quite right. Since then, I've produced work of a high standard that huge range of people have appreciated and enjoyed, and very large numbers of readers have enjoyed, and that have been praised. My latest book has been praised by Dr. Rangan Chatterjee, Dr. Gabor Mate, one of the best-known psychiatrists in the world, Dr. Max Pemberton, one of the best-known psychiatrists in Britain, Hillary Clinton. There's a big long list. So I'm proud of the work that I produce, but I don't present it in a sort of glib narrative, because I think that would be insulting to the people who were harmed. In terms of the things that I got wrong 12 years
Mm.
ago, I think people should see it from the perspective of the people who were harmed by my actions and not from my point of view.
So me asking you whether you've forgiven yourself is not a relevant question, or have you had to go through that process?
I mean, it's a relevant question, but I think it would be insulting for me to, to the people who were harmed by it, for me to sit here talking about it publicly in that way.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you so much for speaking
Thanks so
to
much,
us.
Kate. I enjoyed this. Cheers.
Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention. I hope everyone's been paying attention for the last 30 minutes or so. It's published by Bloomsbury. It's out now, and its author, Johann Hari, has been speaking to us here on Times Radio. Thanks very much, Johann.